So you may have been wondering about this third document that I have here on my screen. We've looked several times at the first document, first.htm, but now we're going to look at a combination first.htm and first no white.htm. And the no white just means no white space in the code. So I'm actually going to open both of these up right now. And you can see that both of them look identical when you're looking at the screen. And again, going into the source of these documents, if I right click and say view page source, you can see that all of the code is neatly organized here. I'm going to do the same thing with the other copy. I'll right click and say view page source. Now things look a little bit different here. So you can see that there are no carriage returns and no extra spaces inserted in this file. And although they both appear identical as far as the browser displaying them is concerned, you can see that the code is much easier to make out in the first example than in the second example. And again, that's simply the white space that's being added. Okay, so what exactly do we mean by white space? Well, let's go back to the desktop here, and I'll open this copy of my document in EM Editor. Again, plain text editor. Now, HTML interprets each occurrence of whitespace, which is carriage returns, spaces, tabs, as one single space. That means that I can actually add as many spaces as I want, as many carriage returns, enough to keep my document legible, so it's easy to read, easy to edit. Now again, if I don't have any of these spaces or carriage returns, it doesn't really matter as far as the browser is concerned when it's displaying the content. It only matters when I go in to edit it. That's why it's important that when you're creating documents for HTML that you add all of these extra spaces. I'm not going to continue on with this, but you get the idea. Let me start a new document and I'll show you exactly how I tend to code things. So the way I start is I'll create my opening tag. I'll save this document on my desktop again as test.htm. Okay, so I've got my first tag. The way I typically code is I create my opening tag and then I'll immediately create my closing tag. What does this do? This actually doesn't give me the chance to forget to close off a tag. I'm always opening and closing tags at the same time. I'm going to do the same thing with the head section of my document. Remember, we have all of these different sections. So head, and again I'll close off that section. And likewise with the body. So there's my basic document right there. Now again, I want to include the title up in the head of the document. Don't worry if you can't type in documents quite this quick. I've probably done thousands of these documents, whereas you may have never done this before, so don't worry about trying to keep up, but you get plenty of chance to try this later. So again, I want to close off my title tag. And now I want to add the title, or in other words, the content that's going to be displayed up in the title bar of the browser. This is my text editor, but it's up in this location on the browser. And I'll call this example. Okay, simple. Again, I'll save this document. So you can see how I've added white space, meaning carriage returns, to keep my code readable and easy to edit. Another trick that I actually use is if I'm nesting tags, in other words putting tags inside each other, and you'll see this a little bit later on in the lists and various other examples. I'll have a tag, and then I'll have another tag, the closing tag, one line down, say. Now between these two, if I've got another tag again nested inside, what I'll do is I'll move in 2 spaces, and I'll just call this tag 2. Now remember, these are just imaginary tags that I'm using for the example. Oops. But you get the idea. And so on. If, again, I have another tag inside of this, I may have tag 3, and maybe this one is on the same line. But now you can see which tags are exactly inside of other tags because they're indented, and then I'll have the content in here. So this may be paragraph tags, it may be other tags that we haven't learned yet, but this is basically the way that I lay out my documents. So here's an example that I borrowed from my examples page from session 1, where the indentation becomes really important. You can see that I've got an ordered list that begins up here and ends down here, but inside that I've actually got list items and other unordered lists with their list items that are indented within that. So it's still easy to see exactly how the items are laid out on the screen.